So BRICS has already overtaken the G7, and it did so back in 2020, but this gap is increasing. This gap is expected to grow in favor of BRICS. You will see that almost half of its annual growth, 49%, is accounted for by BRICS countries, whereas the contribution of the so-called Group of Seven is estimated at 18%.
We must unswervingly promote the democratization of international relations, enhance the representation and voice of developing countries. It has received active response and support from over 160 countries and international organizations.
We see that the energy markets are undergoing shocks. We see tensions provoked in certain regions. First and foremost, right now I refer to the Middle East. We see the short-sighted policies pursued by the European bureaucracy, which is accompanied by aggressive rhetoric and leads to further loss of Europe's position in the world economy. Moreover, it undermines regional as well as global security. As a matter of fact, the European elites are provoking chaos, and they are trying to plunge more and more countries into this chaos. These processes, they were not born of their own. This is the consequences of the fact that over the last decades, the world is undergoing the most profound structural transformation, which is not a transition from one stage to another of the cycle. The very paradigm of global development is shifting. What did we have in the past? What I want to draw your attention to is the fact that for decades, global development model was based around a restricted number of financial centers, technological solution, insurance and logistics hubs, rating agencies, as well as reserve currencies. And this architecture was portrayed as universal, as something that fits allegedly everyone, and hence allegedly neutral. But as a matter of fact, it was increasingly often used as an instrument for political pressure and unfair competition when settlements, technology, logistics, and sometimes even access to information can be switched off in the blink of an eye in order to punish those who choose to act in their own national interests. Basically, this was a deliberately created system of dependence, or system for taking someone else's resources out of them. Right now, the overwhelming majority of countries see that. And this is something that is seen by entrepreneurs, banks, industrial companies, farmers, as well as transportation companies. They see that their investment plans to develop their business can face serious risks, that the external infrastructure they use can be turned against them. That is why countries begin to pursue their own technological solutions, building their own supply routes as well as institutions. Russia feels the full brunt of these changes. The pressure against our country remains, and yet the space for maneuver is growing. We see new partnerships, new financial and technological solutions. We're exploring more promising markets. Thus, Russia believes that the global changes are not just a threat. They also carry enormous opportunities, and to seize them, we're trying to act swiftly and pragmatically. I will reiterate, this current turbulence goes back to the fact that from a vertical hierarchical model which served the interests of a very small group of countries, the world is transitioning to a distributed, more comprehensive multipolar system. What am I referring to? The structure of growth is shifting in favor of new centers of development and the countries of the global south. Colleagues, you see that very well, and this is not a declaration. This is objective realities, because the countries I'm referring to see a growth of population. They see the birth of middle class, a surge in their industry, and expansion of their domestic market, which means new cities are being built, just as roads, ports, energy, and digital grids. They built their financial, educational, and scientific centers. I would like to say in that regard that the world is becoming more equitable, fairer, because economic growth is extending to a growing number of countries, giving billions of people who used to be on the periphery of the global economy new opportunities. Importantly, new centers of growth want to select their trajectory of development on their own. They want to get greater share of value added, build their own logos and standards as well as competencies. So if you look at the global GDP dynamics of the last 5 years, you will see that almost half of its annual growth, 49%, is accounted for by BRICS countries, whereas the contribution of the so-called Group of 7 is estimated at 18%. Just for your information, I can tell you that in 2021-2025, the global economy grew on average by 4.1%. Annually, 2% accounted for by BRICS and just 0.8% accounted for by the G7. Right now, the share of BRICS in the world GDP based on purchasing power parity stands at 40%, whereas the G7 share is less than 29%. So BRICS has already overtaken the G7, and it did so back in 2020, but this gap is increasing. This gap is expected to grow in favor of BRICS. But what are the sources explaining this process? This is due to the fact that BRICS is going to grow at a steadily greater pace. The pace is greater right now, but the trend is going to persist. The G7 is going to grow at best by 1.1% per year, whereas BRICS nations are going to grow by more than 4%. Colleagues, we are not the ones who say that. This is the World Bank and the IMF that are saying that. International institutions have to state this. Of course, it is more interesting to go there where the development is more dynamic. There is a possibility for building your production and selling your products, and that is why the center of the global trade as well as the financial system is going to shift. It is already shifting, and this trend is going to persist. For many years, most flows of trade, capital, and information were going through a handful of Western infrastructure hubs. Even when a good was flowing from one Eurasian country to another Eurasian country, the settlements, logistics, insurance, arbitration were all based on the institutions of third countries, which generated additional costs and created political dependence. Right now, international trade is becoming increasingly efficient. We see growth of supplies without intermediaries. Settlements and national currencies are expanding. New corridors are being set up. In Eurasia, I refer to the North-South corridor, trans-Arctic transportation route, as well as links via the Caspian Sea, Central Asia, the Black Sea, and the Middle East. All of these projects and logistics routes are the emblem of modern development as well as future development. To cite an example and to show that the global trade system ceases to be centered around the West, I can say that over the last 25 years, BRICS' share in the world trade in goods has more than doubled. Last year, BRICS accounted for almost 25% of the world export, and this indicator continues to grow steadily, inexorably, just as intra-BRICS trade is growing, and it has exceeded $1 trillion per annum. A special role is taken on by the connector countries that are linking together markets, technologies, financial flows, and the culture of doing business. And I'm not just referring to simple transit, carrying goods over a certain territory. The most important thing is to ensure trust, logistics, settlements, legal clarity, and technological compatibility. This panel discussion is attended by the President of the Republic of Uzbekistan, whom I would like to welcome once again. I would like to thank you for being here with us on this panel. You are at the helm of the country, which is one of the centers of economic growth. Uzbekistan's population is growing rapidly. It is pursuing industrial plans, improving its agricultural as well as energy potential. Its domestic market is growing too. At the same time, Uzbekistan acts as an important link between Russia, Central Asia, South Asia, China, and the Middle East. When your individual development is harmoniously complemented by advantages of links to other centers of multipolar world, well, these examples are going to be increasingly numerous, and this fully applies to another guest of ours from Tanzania. Once again, welcome, Madam President. Tanzania plays a similar role in East Africa. There's another important trend I would like to point out. The global trade architecture is drifting away from its original principles of the World Trade Organization. Starting from the beginning of the 21st century, the number of bilateral, regional, as well as mega-regional trade arrangements has more than quadrupled. Why is this happening? The erosion of the World Trade Organization was set off by the very authors of these organizations, the Western nations to be more precise. When it benefited them, they promoted the WTO. They invited other countries to join, but once the West started to lose in this competition, universal common rules for the trade introduced by the WTO lost their interests to them. They became more of a burden. And that is when they turned to unilateral restrictions and so-called sanctions. And thus, the Western countries basically switched off the WTO mechanisms, undermining trust in them. And once there is no trust, the institution can no longer function properly. And that means the businesses, the countries will have to find another solution. And they are doing that in the form of bilateral as well as multilateral trade arrangements. I said that before, sanctions and basically the theft of Russia's international reserves has had an irreversible effect on the positions of the world currencies, namely the US dollar and euro. This is an evident fact we have to recognize. Right now, all countries without exception, and I would like to underscore that, just as Russia can instantaneously lose access to their legitimate assets denominated in USD or euro, they can also lose access to the Western financial and payment infrastructure. You and we understand that this is all about unfair competition. There can be different pretexts to start that, and they will always find something. And in our case, this is the conflict in Ukraine. This can also be the conflict in the Middle East, conflicts in Africa, or the attitude towards the LGBT community. You can find fault with anything. But the basic rationale is basically unfair competition. Another thing that undermines trust in the West is the deplorable state of their public finance. I refer to high public debt and high budget deficit. The Eurozone public debt rose to 81.7% of the GDP in 2025. The worst indicators, they are in Greece 146, Italy 137, France 115, Belgium 108%, whereas in Russia it's 16.2% only of the GDP. Well, it's floating a little bit. Yesterday I spoke about that meeting the heads of information agencies, news agencies. Some experts say it's 15.8, but the figures are incomparable. The deficit of the Euro budget in 2021 stands at 3.1% of the GDP. Poland has a maximum deficit of 7.3%. Belgium has a deficit of 5.2%. France, the deficit of 5.1%. The US has 5.9%, whereas in Russia the budget deficit is 2.6%. Maybe by the end of the year it will have risen a little bit, but still it will be inferior to the budget deficit in other advanced economies. This situation is fraught with the possibility of a surge of inflation, which happened back in 2021, 2022, when just in 2 years, the prices in the Eurozone and the US grew by 14%. And that means that countries of the world are decreasing their assets. In the West, they're transitioning to payments in national currencies. They are making wider use of alternative payment systems, increasing the role of digital financial assets as well as the digital currencies of their central banks. Russia is mostly using national currencies in its trade contacts with our leading partners. The share of ruble in our exports stands at 65% or so almost 2/3. I would like to underscore that the world needs a modern, agile, and responsible financial architecture without any risks of restrictions or barriers, rather with incentives for sovereign development. These instruments have to decrease costs, speed up settlements, increase access to funding. And of course, we have to make sure there is no tax evasion, no fraud, no money laundering. This is something that has to be in our spotlight always. Historically, the West has been seen by other countries as the source of technological development. But right now, we see some fundamental shifts. In this context, over the last 25 years, the BRICS countries have significantly increased their high-tech export. Right now, it has risen to more than 1/3 of their.
President Xi Jinping prudently proposed the Global Governance Initiative, emphasizing the adherence to sovereign equality, adhering to the international rule of law, practicing multilateralism, advocating the 5 core concepts of being people-centered and action-oriented. It has received active response and support from over 160 countries and international organizations. Implementing the Global Governance Initiative requires the concerted efforts of the international community. As major powers and permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, China and Russia shoulder important missions in the reform of the global governance system. China is willing to work with all parties, including Russia, to strengthen cooperation on implementing the Global Governance Initiative, and to jointly build an open, inclusive, fair, just, and mutually beneficial world. Here I would like to share 4 points. First, uphold equal cooperation and advocate for a global governance vision based on extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits. Facing the countercurrents of unilateralism and protectionism, the international community needs to uphold the core values and basic principles of multilateralism more than ever. We must uphold true multilateralism and promote equal participation, equal decision-making, and equal benefits for all countries in global governance. We must unswervingly promote the democratization of international relations, enhance the representation and voice of developing countries, abandon the practice of drawing lines based on ideology, and ensure that global governance more fully reflects the legitimate claims of all countries. China has always maintained that all countries should jointly uphold the international system with the United Nations at its core, the international order based on international law, and the basic norms of international relations based on the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. Oppose all forms of hegemonism and power politics. We must uphold universally applicable international legal rules to safeguard international fairness and justice, oppose double standards and selective application, and persist in expanding high standard opening up, bringing new opportunities to the world through our own high quality development. China is willing to take hosting the 33rd Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Economic Leaders Meeting as an opportunity to work with all parties to build an Asia-Pacific community and inject new momentum into the development and prosperity of the Asia-Pacific region and the world. China continues to promote high-quality Belt and Road cooperation, leads collaboration within multilateral mechanisms like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS, supports the development and revitalization of the Global South, and fosters international dialogue and cooperation on major issues such as climate change and artificial intelligence.
That is the Vice President of the People's Republic of China,